Racist bikers torment a black woman, thinking no one will stand up for her until her brother, Snoop Dogg, shows up to set things straight. Subscribe for more and share this video to keep the conversation going. Gloria Burroughs sat by the window of the small diner, watching as the last rays of sunlight bounced off the stainless steel counters, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Crescent Ridge was quiet, and that eerie way small towns sometimes are, welcoming on the surface, but with an undercurrent of something unspoken, something that never quite faded. For Gloria, that tension had become a daily reality. It wasn't just the lingering stares or the hushed whispers that cut off whenever she walked by. It was the little things, cashiers taking just a second too long to ring up her order, neighbors conveniently forgetting to return her morning wave. And then there were the bigger things, like the spray-painted slurs someone had left on her car a few months back. She sighed, wiping the counter for what felt like the 100th time. The diner was nearly empty, save for a couple of regulars nursing their coffee in the corner booth. This was her favorite time of day, just before closing, when the world quieted down, and for a brief moment, she could breathe. Moving to Crescent Ridge had been her way of stepping away from the chaos of Los Angeles. She wanted peace, a life outside the shadow of her famous brother. To the world, he was Snoop Dogg, hip-hop legend, cultural icon, the guy who could walk into any room and own it without saying a word. But to her, he was just Calvin, the same little brother who used to follow her around, asking a million questions and making her laugh with his ridiculous impressions. Here in Crescent Ridge, people either didn't know or didn't care who her brother was. At first, that anonymity had been a relief. But over time, the town's quiet hostility started to wear on her. The jingle of the diner's doorbell pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up and felt her stomach tighten. A group of men had just walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, leather jackets covered in patches. She knew them well enough. The Iron Claws. A local biker gang with a reputation for stirring up trouble. She'd seen them around before, always in a pack, always loud, always looking for a way to make their presence known. They slid into a booth near the back, their laughter echoing through the nearly empty diner. Gloria forced a polite smile as she approached, notepad in hand. "Evening, folks. What can I get you?" The leader, a man with a shaved head and a snake-like tattoo creeping up his neck, looked her up and down with a smirk. "How about a little respect?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. The others chuckled. Gloria didn't flinch. "Our special today is the meatloaf," she said, ignoring the jab. "Anything else?" The man leaned back, folding his arms. "Yeah. Bring it fast. We don't got all night." She gave a small nod and turned back toward the counter, her hands trembling as she jotted down the order. She could feel their eyes still on her, hear the low murmurs and chuckles as they exchanged whispers. She focused on her breathing, forcing herself to stay composed. By the time she brought their food, their conversation had grown louder, cruder. Most of their jokes were aimed directly at her. She set the plates down quickly and walked away, avoiding their gazes. Then she heard it. A loud clatter. She glanced back and saw the salt shaker knocked over, grain scattered across the table and the floor. The men erupted in laughter. Gloria clenched her fists. Every part of her wanted to walk over, tell them to clean up their mess, to take their filth and leave. But she knew better. That's exactly what they wanted, a reaction, something to feed off. When they finally left, they made sure to leave a final message. A crumpled napkin sat on the table, a hastily drawn swastika scrawled across it. Their last word, their final insult, before stepping out into the night, still laughing. Gloria stared at it for a long moment before grabbing it and tossing it in the trash. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. The next few days, the Iron Claws came back. More often. Louder. More aggressive. Scratches on her car. Insults thrown in her direction as they passed her on the street. The feeling of eyes always watching. They thought no one would stand up for her. But everything changed when her brother found out. And when Snoop Dogg rolled into Crescent Ridge, the Iron Claws were about to learn just how big of a mistake they had made. She thought no one would stand up for her until her brother, Snoop Dogg, showed up. Subscribe for more and share this video to keep the conversation going. Loria had always believed that if she kept her head down, if she just minded her business, the world would let her be. Crescent Ridge had taught her otherwise. Each act of harassment chipped away at the fragile sense of safety she had tried to build. At first, it was the stares, the whispers, the way people moved around her like she was something they couldn't quite accept. Then came the spray paint on her car, the laughter as she walked past. And now, she was being watched. One evening, after closing the diner, she stepped outside to find them again. The same group of men. The same leather jackets. The same sneering faces. They leaned against their bikes across the street, arms crossed, their eyes locked onto her like wolves sizing up prey. She quickened her pace. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs as she unlocked her car, hands shaking. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called out, his voice laced with mockery. "Where you running off to?" She didn't answer. Didn't look back. Just started the car and gripped the wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. When she got home, she locked every door, every window. Double-checked them. Triple-checked. Then she sat down on the couch, staring into the silence of her own home, feeling the walls close in on her. That night, sleep didn't come. She lay there, eyes fixed on the ceiling, the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now fully engulfing her. She couldn't keep living like this. But what could she do? The police had brushed her off before, made excuses. She already knew how that would go. Then, just as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let them win. But she also knew she couldn't do it alone. The phone buzzed on her nightstand, pulling her from restless sleep. 3:12 a.m. The screen's glow cut through the darkness. Unknown caller. Her stomach twisted. This was the third night in a row. Her hands hovered over the screen. Ignore it. Answer. Her pulse hammered in her ears as her thumb hesitated, then, almost against her better judgment, she swiped. Hello? Silence. Then, breathing. Low. Deliberate. Then the voice. Still awake, sweetheart? Mocking. Familiar. She slammed the phone down. Her breath came fast, shallow. She turned off the ringer and tossed the phone onto the floor like that could keep the voice away. It didn't. It was still in her head. First, it had been the stares. Then the slurs on her car. Now this. The phone calls. The motorcycles revving past her house long after midnight. They wanted her scared. They wanted her to break. And maybe, for a moment, they had won. The next day, the diner felt different. Quieter. Customers who usually greeted her with a nod now avoided her eyes. Word had spread. The video she had posted, the one where she filmed them surrounding her car, was everywhere. Some people supported her. Others? Maybe if you hadn't stirred things up, her coworker Sheila muttered, shaking her head as she refilled the salt shakers. Loria clenched her jaw and kept wiping down the counter. No point in arguing. Not when her mind was already somewhere else, on the video. She had filmed it out of desperation, her hands shaking so bad the footage barely held steady. But her fear? That was crystal clear. She hadn't expected it to blow up. Within hours, it spread across social media. Messages poured in. Support. Hate. Encouragement. Threats. And then, the next morning, another message. Scratched into the hood of her car. Snitch. She stood in the parking lot, staring at the damage, her stomach twisting. Laughter echoed from the street corner. She didn't even need to turn around. She already knew who it was. They weren't hiding anymore. That night, she sat in her living room, staring at the screen of her phone. The video looped in front of her. The ring of motorcycles. The voices. The comments. "We know where you live. You'll regret this. Leave town before it's too late." Her thumb hovered over the delete button. She could erase it. Make it go away. Maybe they would, too. But no. Deleting the video wouldn't erase what happened. It wouldn't make her any safer. For the first time in years, she thought about calling her brother. But that was a last resort. Wasn't it? She had always wanted to prove she could handle things on her own. That she wasn't just Snoop Dogg's sister. She had built this life for herself. Brick by brick. Then, the phone rang again. This time, she didn't answer. This time, she pressed record. And let the world see everything. Gloria held up her phone, fingers gripping it tight. She needed more evidence. One video wasn't enough. If they came for her tonight, she wanted the world to see. Hours passed, the silence stretching, pressing down on her. She sat by the window, watching. Every set of headlights made her breath catch, but the bikers never showed. Not that night. They came the next evening. Gloria had just closed the diner. Her co-workers were long gone, the parking lot nearly empty, except for her car. And the motorcycles. She heard them before she saw them, the deep growl of engines cutting through the cool night air. A row of bikes rolled in just as she turned off the lights. Dread wrapped around her chest like a vice. She locked the door and stepped outside, trying to keep her movements calm, steady, but her legs felt weak. Her heart pounded so hard, she was sure they could hear it. "Hey there, sweetheart," Roy, the leader, grinned as he swung a leg off his bike. The way he looked at her made her skin crawl. "Just thought we'd stop by. Say hi." Another man chuckled. Gloria's fingers tightened around her phone in her pocket, ready to hit record again. Roy took a step closer. "You should have kept your mouth shut." His voice was casual. Too casual. People who stir up trouble don't last long around here. Gloria didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her phone and lifted it. "You're being recorded." Her voice was steady, even if her hands weren't. Roy smirked. "That's supposed to scare me?" Another step forward. This time, she took a step back. "You think anyone cares about your little video?" He gestured around. "Half this town's already on our side." Her pulse thundered in her ears. Panic clawed at her chest, but she refused to show it. "You don't scare me." A lie. But she said it anyway. Roy's smirk faded. For a split second, something darker flashed in his eyes. Then, spit. He turned and hocked a wad of saliva onto the ground at her feet. Then climbed onto his bike. "We'll see about that." Engines roared as the iron claws sped off into the night. Gloria stood frozen, shaking, her phone still raised. She had gotten it all on camera. Every second. But as she played the footage back, she felt no relief. Only exhaustion. She sat on the couch, phone in hand. Scrolling through her contacts. Her thumb hovered over the name she had been avoiding. Calvin. She stared at it. Then, before she could second guess herself, she tapped the screen. The phone rang once. Twice. Then his voice. Warm. Familiar. "Gloria? What's wrong?" The floodgates broke. She told him everything. The harassment. The threats. The fear that followed her everywhere. By the time she finished, tears streaked her face. "I didn't know who else to call," she whispered. A pause. Then, "You did the right thing." His voice was calm. Steady. But underneath it, tension. "I'm coming. A promise. And I swear to you, this ends now." Morning came, but the fear didn't fade. Her phone buzzed again, But this time, when she saw the name, her chest eased just a little. Calvin. She picked up immediately. "I'm already on the road," he said, no small talk, no hesitation. "I'll be there this afternoon." His voice was smooth, but she knew him too well. She could hear it, the edge. Calvin wasn't just coming to visit. He was coming to make a statement. For the first time in days, Gloria felt like she could breathe. She spent the morning cleaning, as if scrubbing the floors could wash away the fears that had soaked into her bones. But no matter how hard she tried, the unease lingered. Every time a motorcycle engine echoed down the street, her heart jumped. Her phone buzzed. A notification. The video had spread. Further. Activists. Celebrities. The world was watching now. Messages poured in. Support. Hate. Warnings. People who didn't even know her were dissecting her life. Taking sides. By midday, the tension in Crescent Ridge was thick enough to choke on. The iron claws hadn't shown up. But that only made it worse. The calm before the storm. It wasn't subtle. 3 black SUVs rolled down Main Street. Tinted windows gleaming in the sun. People stopped. Stared. The vehicle slowed to a stop outside the diner. Gloria stepped outside just as the doors opened. And Snoop Dogg stepped out. Dressed in casual sweats, sunglasses low on his nose, a gold chain catching the light. But there was nothing casual about the way he moved. Gone was the easygoing stage persona. This wasn't Snoop Dogg the entertainer. This was Calvin Broadus. Her brother. And he wasn't alone. 2 bodyguards stepped out behind him, scanning the street with sharp, unblinking eyes. The crowd grew fast. Phones lifted. Cameras flashed. Whispers turned to murmurs. Murmurs turned to loud chatter. "No way. Is that really him? What's he doing here?" Gloria felt her chest tighten. Tears burned in her eyes as she crossed the parking lot. Calvin opened his arms. She collapsed into them. For the first time in days. She felt safe. He held her tight, his voice low in her ear. "I got you, sis." But the way he said it, it wasn't just comfort. It was a warning. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. And the iron claws were about to find out exactly who they had messed with. Even as relief washed over her, Gloria couldn't ignore the stares. Down the street, a group of men in leather jackets had begun to gather. Watching. Waiting. Calvin didn't waste time. After making sure Gloria had security in place, he made a call to the local sheriff. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Within the hour, Sheriff Wallace, a balding man with a thick mustache and tired eyes, was sitting across from Calvin inside the diner. Gloria sat nearby, listening as her brother laid it all out. "This isn't just some local beef," Calvin said, voice low but firm. "This is harassment. And it's about to blow up if you don't handle it." Wallace shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Mr. Broadus, I understand your concerns, but they're not boys." Calvin cut him off. "They're grown men. Terrorizing my sister. And I'm not leaving until you do something about it." The sheriff hesitated, glancing at Gloria. "We'll look into it." "Not good enough." Calvin leaned in, voice deadly calm. "You don't want this kind of attention on your town. Trust me. Either you handle it, or I will." Wallace left without making any promises. But Calvin wasn't worried. He knew how to use his influence. That evening, Calvin and his team headed straight for the bar where the Iron Claws gathered. Gloria begged him not to go. "Stay here," he said. "You've done enough. Let me handle this." The bar was dim, thick with the scent of stale beer and smoke. The Iron Claws were already there, lounging around a pool table. Roy spotted Calvin first. His smirk faded when he realized exactly who had just walked in. Well, Roy drawled, setting down his beer. The big man himself. What brings you to our little town? Calvin didn't flinch. We need to talk. Roy leaned back against the pool table, feigning boredom. I think your sister's already said enough. Calvin stepped closer. His bodyguards moved with him. Listen to me carefully, he said. This ends tonight. No more calls. No more threats. You touch her again, and I'll make sure the only thing people remember about this town is how you destroyed it. Roy's eyes darkened. You think you can walk in here and tell us what to do? No. Calvin's voice was cold. I know I can. The tension in the room suffocated. Roy's friends shifted nervously. But Roy... He held his ground. Finally, he sneered. This ain't over. Calvin didn't smile. Yeah, it is. He turned and walked out, leaving Roy seething. That night, Calvin posted another video. But this time, it wasn't just about Loria. It was bigger than that. He spoke about what had happened. The threats. The harassment. The hate. And he made it clear, this wasn't just about one town. The video exploded. Celebrities. Activists. News outlets. The world was watching. By the next morning, Crescent Ridge wasn't so quiet anymore. The sheriff had no choice. Arrests were made. Several members of the Iron Claws were taken into custody. And Roy? Charged with harassment and vandalism. But even as the legal process began, Loria knew this wasn't over. The damage had already been done. Rebuilding her life wouldn't happen overnight. But as she stood beside Calvin, watching the news coverage unfold, she felt something she hadn't in weeks. Hope. The next morning, Crescent Ridge wasn't the same. Reporters lined the streets. Cameras flashed. The town's usual rhythm was gone, replaced by the low hum of news vans and police cruisers parked outside the station where Roy and his men were being held. Loria watched from the diner window, gripping her coffee cup. It felt surreal. Everything had changed overnight. Across from her, Calvin scrolled through his phone, updates pouring in. His presence was a comfort, but the weight on her chest hadn't lifted. Even with the arrests. Even with the outpouring of support. The fear lingered. What's next? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Calvin looked up. His expression was calm, but serious. We keep pushing. She swallowed. It doesn't feel over. Calvin set his phone down, reached across the table, and rested his hand on hers. It's not. The days that followed were a blur. Legal proceedings. News coverage. Headlines dissecting every moment. Calvin's legal team wasted no time. Charges were filed. The case would be handled swiftly. Publicly. Loria sat in the courtroom during the preliminary hearings. Roy was there. So were the Iron Claws. She kept her head high. Refused to let them see her fear. But every second in that room felt like war. Roy's lawyer tried to spin the story. Misunderstandings. Taken out of context. Blown out of proportion. But the world had already seen the truth. Crescent Ridge wanted to pretend it had never happened. That it wasn't about race. That it wasn't about power. That it wasn't about fear. But the cameras were still rolling. And the world? The world wasn't looking away. The evidence was undeniable. Security footage from the diner. Witness testimonies. The viral video of the parking lot confrontation. It all stacked up against Roy and his crew. Still, Roy didn't flinch. Even in court, he smirked at Loria whenever their eyes met, his arrogance unchanged, as if none of this mattered. But his confidence cracked when one of his own men turned on him. Under oath, the biker admitted what the whole town already knew. They had targeted Loria because of her race, because of her connection to Calvin. The courtroom fell silent. For the first time, Roy looked shaken. And when the judge denied bail and set a trial date, Loria finally felt something she hadn't in a long time. A flicker of relief. Outside the courthouse, Crescent Ridge was split in two. On one side, supporters held signs, calling for justice. On the other, people grumbled about the town's reputation being ruined. And in the diner? The silence was louder than ever. Customers avoided her. Conversation stopped when she walked by. Even Sheila, the woman who had worked beside her for years, kept her distance. One night, as they closed up, Sheila finally said it. "You should think about leaving." Loria turned, staring. "Excuse me?" Sheila sighed, eyes darting toward the window. "This isn't the kind of place that forgets." The words cut deep. "I'm not running." Loria's voice was steady. But inside, doubt crept in. Staying meant fighting. And she wasn't sure how much fight she had left. As the media storm began to fade, Calvin prepared to leave. The morning of his departure, they sat on the porch, sipping coffee as the sun rose. "You sure about this?" he asked. She nodded. "I can't leave. Not like this." Calvin smiled, but there was worry in his eyes. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. But if you ever need me..." "I know." She squeezed his hand. They hugged tight before he climbed into the SUV. Loria watched until the convoy disappeared down the road. And then, for the first time since this all began, she was truly alone. The weeks that followed were slow and hard. The diner sat half empty. Whispers followed her everywhere. But not everyone turned their backs on her. One afternoon, a young couple walked in, a black man and a white woman, holding hands. They smiled nervously as they took a seat by the window. When Loria came over, the woman hesitated, then said softly, "We saw your story online. We just wanted to say thank you for standing up." Loria blinked back tears. It wasn't much, but it was something. The trial began. Loria stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters. This moment was bigger than her. It was bigger than Crescent Ridge. It was about every person who had ever been told to stay quiet, to back down, to just accept the way things were. When the verdict came down, guilty, on multiple counts, cheers erupted. Loria exhaled, her body sagging with a mix of relief and exhaustion. Justice had been served, but the scars remained. Months later, the town began to change. More people of color moved in. Conversations about race and equality grew louder. The diner expanded. Loria hired a diverse staff, turning the place into more than just a business. It became a symbol, a place that stood for resilience, for change. She kept Calvin's picture on the wall, a reminder of the brother who stood by her when she needed him most. And one evening, as she locked up for the night, she stepped outside and looked down Main Street. For the first time in a long, long time, she saw something different. Hope,